Hi, everyone. So we are going to get started. Hello, thank you for joining us. My name is Audrey Gear, and I'm a Startup Innovation Specialist here at the Good Food Institute. So welcome to GFI's webinar on the state of the industry for fermentation-enabled meat, seafood, eggs, and dairy products. Today, my colleagues and I will cover the rapidly evolving fermentation industry, including the commercial landscape, public and private investment, scientific progress, and regulatory developments. Before we dive in, I would just like to go over a few things for housekeeping. First of all, we will send a copy of the presentation to all registered attendees, and we'll post the recording on GFI's YouTube channel. We'll also send you a direct link to the slide deck we're presenting from today. We will have time for questions at the end of the presentation, but feel free to submit questions at any time during the webinar via the Q&A box. We'll try to get to some of those Q&A questions via text throughout the presentation, but again, please submit them through the Q&A box so we can better keep track of your questions. And third, we'll be hosting a virtual networking event immediately following this webinar, and you can register using the link in the chat if you'd like to join us today for some one-on-one conversations with others in the alt protein industry. And for those of you who aren't yet familiar with us, the Good Food Institute is a 501c3 nonprofit that's developing the roadmap for sustainable, secure, and just protein supply. We work across the areas of science and technology, corporate engagement, and policy to accelerate innovation in alternative proteins. We are 100% powered by philanthropy, not by industry. And the key question that we're working to address is how will we feed 10 billion people by 2050 and do so sustainably, efficiently, and safely? Industrial animal agriculture is in the top 2 to 3 most significant contributors to the world's most pressing environmental issues. It uses 75% of agricultural land, yet it provides only 33% of the global protein supply. And industrial animal agriculture is the #1 user of medically important antibiotics. Here at GFI, we really believe that an answer to these many issues is to make the meat, eggs, and dairy products that people love in a more sustainable and efficient way. With alternative proteins, we can make proteins directly from plants with fermentation technology or by using animal cell culture. Which brings me to today's topic, fermentation, which is an ancient and powerful technology that is being harnessed in new ways to create alternative proteins. At GFI, we define fermentation as the use of single-cell fungi, mycelium, bacteria, microalgae, and other microbes as a bioproduction platform to modify or produce proteins, fats, or other functional ingredients. It is increasingly being used to create both ingredients and standalone meat or seafood analog products. And today's presentation will cover key activity in the fermentation sector in 2021 and is based on GFI's annual State of the Industry reports, which were released just last Thursday. So before we dive into 2021 developments, I do just want to take a minute or so to orient everyone around the 3 broad types of fermentation that we'll be discussing today. And at GFI, we think about fermentation as occurring across the 3 main categories of traditional, biomass, and precision fermentation. And I do just want to note that this language used here is not set in stone, and it's being used to describe fermentation production processes. So it will likely not translate over to consumer products. But first is traditional fermentation. And this is probably what most of us are familiar with. And this is where you use live microorganisms to modify and process plant-based materials. So examples include fermenting soybeans into tempeh and using lactic acid bacteria to produce dairy. This is also the process used to make things like sauerkraut, kimchi, and beer. Next, we have precision fermentation. And with this, we use microbial hosts as essentially little cell factories, where they're engineered to produce specific, high-value functional ingredients. These can include things like enzymes, flavoring agents, proteins, vitamins, natural pigments, and fats. And the ingredients these microbial cell factories produce are typically high-value ingredients. They're incorporated at lower levels in finished products, but they really are powerful enablers of improved sensory and functional attributes. For example, we are seeing a number of companies using precision fermentation to produce recombinant whey protein that can be incorporated into plant-based dairy formulations. Precision fermentation can also be used to create things like growth factors that are used in cultivated meat production. I think it's really important to note that we're using precision fermentation in new ways for alternative proteins, but this is not a new technology or a new technique. 90% of modern dairy cheese production uses fermentation-derived rennet enzymes rather than extracts from calf stomachs. This is also the same process that produces things like insulin. The third kind of fermentation is biomass fermentation, where you're using the microorganism itself as a source of food. And this leverages the fast growth and high protein content of a microorganism to efficiently produce large quantities of protein. Biomass fermentation offers the greatest opportunity to produce protein at scale because many microorganisms can grow very quickly and efficiently, often doubling their weight in just a few hours. Corn made of mycoprotein is an example of biomass fermentation we're all probably familiar with. And as a production platform, fermentation is incredibly diverse. This mind map illustrates the range of production approaches, organisms, product types, feedstocks, production methods, business strategies, and services that apply to fermentation. And there is room for innovation across all of these areas. And with that overview, let's dive right in to discuss key developments in the commercial landscape in 2021. So you'll see from this graph, the fermentation landscape is growing rapidly. At the time of publication of the reports, at least 15 startups that we know of were founded in 2021 that are dedicated to the use of fermentation for alternative proteins. Of these new entrants, 9 are focused on precision fermentation and 6 are focused on biomass fermentation. And the total number of companies focused on fermentation-enabled alternative proteins rose to at least 88. This is an increase of 20% from the number of known companies in 2020. In addition to the 88 companies dedicated towards using fermentation for alt proteins, at least 75 additional companies have a business line in alternative protein fermentation. Over 50% of companies devoted to fermentation and alt proteins formed in the past 3 years from 2019 to 2021. And here, if we look at companies by type of fermentation, we see that there are 6 traditional fermentation companies, 43 biomass, and 39 precision fermentation companies. I do just want to note that many companies using traditional fermentation, such as nut-based and other fermented cheese and butter made from plants, an example of this would be Mayoko's Creamery, are not counted in this report. Instead, they are covered in GFI's State of the Industry report on plant-based meat, eggs, and dairy. We have seen a rapid rise over the past 2 years in new companies applying precision and biomass fermentation technologies to all proteins. Between 2019 and 2021, an average of 10 new precision fermentation companies were established each year. And most precision fermentation companies, over 60% in fact, are focused on the dairy category. About 20% are developing ingredients to be used in meat, and the remainder are looking to innovate in seafood or to produce egg proteins. Formation of biomass fermentation companies has also accelerated in the past few years, with 12 new companies emerging in 2020 and 6 in 2021. The majority of these companies produce ingredients or end products for use in meat analog products. Seafood is an emerging area, with half of the new biomass companies in 2021 stating that seafood was a focus area. The fermentation industry spans the globe. Fermentation companies operate in at least 24 countries, and the largest concentration of companies is by far in the United States, as you can see here, with at least 30, followed by Israel with 9 and Spain with 4. Production capacity remains a bottleneck across the alternative protein sector, and we see those same manufacturing capacity constraints in fermentation, particularly in precision fermentation. Despite these challenges, in 2021, several companies announced new facilities to scale production of their products. Notably, the majority of facilities that were announced are designed for biomass fermentation production, and that is likely because biomass fermentation facilities do not require quite as high of the CapEx expenditures as precision fermentation. Highlighted on this map are several facilities that were either announced or completed in 2021. We see several facilities being built in the United States and in Europe, in particular the Netherlands, which is emerging as an alternative protein powerhouse, as well as a few being built in Nordic countries like Finland and Sweden. Some notable facilities I'd like to spend a minute or so pointing out. Enough announced plans to build a large fermented protein facility to produce their mycoprotein ingredient, which they call Abunda. They expect to produce 50,000 tons per year by 2027. And what's really interesting about this is that the facility is co-located with a Cargill commodity processing site. And according to the company, Cargill's starch facility will supply the feedstocks to grow their mycoprotein, and the waste from Enough's production will be processed by Cargill's ethanol plant, which is just a great example of the circular economy at play. Superbrewed Foods, which came out of Stealth in 2021 and was formerly known as White Dog Labs, repurposed an ethanol plant in Minnesota to produce their alternative proteins via anaerobic fermentation methods. Because they were able to repurpose an ethanol facility, they were able to get their production up and running in a relatively short time frame of just around 9 months. And Culture Biosciences secured $80 million to ramp up production of 5-liter and 250-liter cloud bioreactors, so their clients can begin sensory and regulatory testing of larger quantities of novel fermentation-enabled or cell-based products on their path to market. And importantly, this facility will enable fermentation companies to gather crucial scaling data to really accelerate their transition into a true commercial scale facility or co-manufacturing relationship. In 2021, companies advanced applications of fermentation technology to produce a diversity of products, ranging from ground meat, whole cut meats, eggs, milk, cheese, ice cream, seafood, fats, and oils. Fermentation is also playing a truly critical role in enhancing plant-based products across these categories. And as these products are coming to market, companies are touting not only the taste, functionality, nutrition of their products, but also the sustainability of their manufacturing processes. Right now, I'll just touch upon a few of the product launches that happened in 2021. Within the meat category, fermentation presents opportunities to achieve a fibrous texture in whole cut and ground meat products without the extrusion processes on which plant-based products have traditionally depended. Nature's Fine, Chunk, Meaty, and the Better Meat Co. are just a few of the companies producing meat via fermentation. To date, there are at least 11 companies producing alternative seafood using fermentation-enabled technology. Seafood does remain a significant white space. However, we have been seeing rising interest in seafood every single year. In 2021, Aquacultured Foods debuted a whole muscle seafood alternative produced through biomass fermentation, and the company signed a proof of concept agreement with Migros, Switzerland's largest retailer, to speed up product development. 2021 was a very exciting year for the egg category. In addition to the key functionality requirements, there are dozens of different kinds of proteins found in eggs, making them quite challenging to reproduce. The Every Company, which was formerly known as Clara Foods, launched the first animal-free egg protein made via precision fermentation. It is a soluble, virtually tasteless and odorless egg protein that can be used to enhance a range of beverages and foods, and was first debuted in partnership with Press Juicery. And then earlier this year in 2022, Every also released their animal-free egg white protein. Dairy is another major area of focus for fermentation companies. Nearly 65% of precision fermentation companies are focused on creating proteins or fats found in dairy. And there are also several biomass fermentation companies creating products for dairy applications. And in 2021, Perfect Day's recombinant whey proteins became broadly commercially available in a range of products and brands. It was found in milk, ice cream, cream cheese, and protein powders. And notable partnerships included one with General Mills to launch a cream cheese and a trial with Starbucks to serve milk made with Perfect Day's animal-free dairy proteins. Fat is another critical area of the sensory experience as it contributes to both flavor and mouthfeel. 2021 was a breakout year for fat-focused fermentation companies, with 4 new companies launching to create fats and oils. And at least 7 fermentation companies are now dedicated to producing fats used in alternative protein production. Of these, 6 are leveraging precision fermentation. Fermentation also holds disruptive power for other products made from animals beyond meat, eggs, dairy, and seafood. Infant nutrition, pet food, honey and collagen, and gelatin are additional product categories that are seeing fermentation innovations. Infant nutrition, for example, is a growing area of investor interest. Helena, which uses precision fermentation to produce human infant formula, raised $20 million in the Series A funding round to begin its manufacturing commercialization process. Pet food is another growing category. Bond Pet Foods announced a partnership with Hill's Pet Nutrition to use Bond's proteins in their traditional meat formulations. Melly Bio held a tasting of the world's first honey produced via microbial fermentation that is bioidentical to honey produced by bees. The company received special mention in Time's list of the best inventions of 2021. The collagen and gelatin category also saw new developments. Geltor debuted an animal-free collagen product called Primacol that is bioidentical to poultry collagen, but made via precision fermentation. Another area of innovation is functional ingredient replacements across a range of product applications. Motif Foodworks announced the commercial release of their myoglobin Hamami, a yeast-based heme protein that is identical to bovine myoglobin. The ingredient is available to plant-based meat manufacturers to give their products the flavor and aroma of conventional meat. Liven Proteins is creating a microbial fermentation ingredients platform, engineering real animal-free functional proteins from industry byproducts. Shiru is looking at the functional qualities of ingredients like emulsification, gelation, solubility, and foaming that you get from dairy and egg proteins and gelatin, and they're developing alternatives. And Paleo is investigating which proteins give meat and fish their unique qualities, identifying them and reproducing them via precision fermentation. Ultimately, in the future, we won't see alternative protein production platforms as distinct industry segments, but really rather as one large industry where we produce animal product alternatives across a spectrum, utilizing ingredients from one or more technologies to achieve the desired sensory and functional properties. Fermentation will play a critical role in these hybrid products. You can see here how various fermentation-derived products are involved across the production pillars, and the Impossible Burger is a great example of a hybrid product on the market as it uses plant-based proteins and soy hemoglobin made via precision fermentation. We're also increasingly seeing established food and meat companies enter into strategic partnerships with alternative protein startups. These partnerships leverage incumbents' expertise and capabilities, such as in production, distribution, and marketing, while exposing them to new ideas and innovation, and increasingly helping them to meet their CSR goals and targets for protein transitions. These partnerships allow startups to be more asset light, scale quickly, and it de-risks some R&D. I've been mentioning several partnerships throughout the presentation, and I won't have time to talk about all that are listed on this slide, but there are a few I'd like to highlight. Unilever has partnered with Enough to bring new plant-based meat products to market. They'll use Enough's mycoprotein as an input in the vegetarian butcher branded products. And this partnership will help Unilever reach their new annual global sales target of 1 billion euros from alternatives by 2025 to 2027. AB InBev partnered with Evergrain to use spent grain from the beer making process to create alternative protein products. And this is a great example of upcycling and the ability to create even more sustainable products using fermentation. And the Better Meat Company signed a deal with meat industry incumbent Hormel Foods to create better products with Better Meat's mycoprotein Rhiza. I'll now hand it over to my colleague Sharon to discuss investments made in 2021.
Thank you, Audrey. So yes, let's all now take a look at how the new investment that came into the industry last year helped support a lot of this growth and expansion of new products that Audrey touched upon. So as a whole, alternative proteins raised $5 billion in 2021, which nearly doubled the industry's investments to date and brought total investments to over 11 billion. Excitingly, this 5 billion represented nearly half of the 12.8 billion of private investments that were made across all of food tech last year. And that really demonstrates the central place that alternative proteins hold for investors when they consider the future of food. Taking a look at the individual segments of alternative protein, we can see that a majority of investments have flowed to plant-based companies historically, as it is, of course, the most developed segment. But fermentation and cultivated meat are rapidly catching up as investors better understand these higher tech segments and are jumping in to diversify their portfolios. Zooming into fermentation, we can see that investments, in fact, nearly tripled to $1.7 billion last year, which really cemented fermentation's position within alternative proteins and their investment landscape. This $1.7 billion accounted for 1/3 of all investments in alternative proteins in 2021, which is quite a jump from the less than 20% share that they held the year prior. Now, taking a look between the three types of fermentation that Audrey expertly defined, we can see that precision fermentation companies raised the most capital last year. In fact, over half of all fermentation investments secured in 2021. Meanwhile, biomass fermentation companies raised about 1/3 of all investments, and traditional fermentation companies accounted for the rest. These ratios do align with the relative costs of various technologies. So as already discussed, precision fermentation typically requires the most specialized equipment, which also tends to be the most expensive and often has higher research and development expenditures. But something else that could account for some of these differences is a point that Audrey already noted, which is that many companies that employ traditional fermentation are categorized as plant-based in our analysis, and thus their investments are not captured here. Thank you. Taking a look at the geographic distribution, the vast majority of investments, about 90%, were made in US-based companies. And this really demonstrates the major opportunity for other countries to catch up, as this, of course, is a global challenge that we're facing, and we need a global solution. For companies, raises did account for much of the US investments, so there is also room for broader company and geographical distribution of investments moving forward. Taking a look at some of those notable raises from last year, we can see the 4 rounds that accounted for a majority of investments. They sum to about 1.1 billion of the 1.7 billion raised last year. And excitingly, many of these rounds were led by well-known investors who are not by any means specialists per se in alternative proteins, but are really looking across the investment landscape at the best opportunities. So first, we've got biomass fermentation company Nature's Find, which raised a $350 million investment in a Series C round, which was led by SoftBank's Vision Fund 2. Precision fermentation company Perfect Day also raised $350 million in a Series D, and this was co-led by 2 government-related investors, Temasek of Singapore and CPP Investments, which invests assets of the Canadian Pension Plan. Motif Foodworks, which uses a variety of fermentation technologies to create their food breakthroughs, including precision fermentation, raised $226 million in a Series B that was co-led by major investors Ontario Teachers Pension Plan and BlackRock. And then a third precision fermentation company, Every, raised $175 million in a Series C round, which was co-led by a new investor, McWin, and an existing investor, Rage Capital. Now, alternative proteins are increasingly being recognized as a core part of climate tech. And I think that's also speaking to and part of the driver of many of the mainstream investors I noted in some of those large rounds participating in the industry. I'm seeing this both in the investment figures, in conversations we're having with investors, and in industry publications. So for example, PitchBook, which is a leading provider of private market data, includes cultivated meat and alternative proteins in its climate map. And alternative protein specialists, venture capital funds are listed among the top early stage venture capital climate tech funds. And you can see examples of this on the slide. Well, this recognition of alternative proteins as climate tech and the growth we've seen in fermentation investments and in alternative protein investments broadly is impressive. It's worth noting that investments in alternative proteins remain really a minuscule fraction of the trillions of dollars that we've been invested globally in climate tech companies. So just as an example, private capital in early stage electric transportation companies alone, just private capital, is nearly 6 times greater than all the investments in alternative proteins. And that's despite the fact that transportation contributes less to global greenhouse gas emissions than global livestock production, and also has fewer impacts on climate more broadly. And the 6 times greater figure doesn't even start to include investments beyond venture and private equity capital, such as government funding and other support, and funding raised through public equity and debt markets, which alternative proteins have benefited from much, much less than electric transportation and other clean technology and climate tech. More investment in alternative protein is absolutely critical to help us reach various public and private net zero commitments. These investments would allow companies to contribute to critical research and development, scale their production, which is a critical need, as has been discussed, and bring costs down to better compete with conventionally produced animal protein. And with that, I'd love to turn it over to Ryan to speak to how some of these companies are working towards those goals.
Thank you, Sharon. Next, let's talk about advancements in science and technology for the alternative protein industry in 2021. Next slide. Significant progress was made towards several prioritized solutions listed in the Good Food Institute's Open Access Advancing Solutions for Alternative Proteins repository. This repository was created to provide technical background and orient priorities for research, investment, and funding of fermentation efforts in alternative protein. For comprehensive microbial screening to identify new protein production candidate strains, one of the solutions in our repository, we saw greater use of bacteria and strains other than E. coli in 2021. For biosynthetic pathway discovery for fermentation-produced molecules, we saw strategies for genome mining and molecular manipulation developed by scientists. For producing animal-like fats through microbial fermentation, we saw several companies report breakthroughs in the production of animal fats using precision fermentation, including C16 Biosciences, FarmSo, Milton Marble, and Nourish Ingredients. For fat production and encapsulation within oleaginous yeast, GFI's most recent research grant program funds included 2 proposals that screen oleaginous yeast strains for the ability to accumulate lipids similar in structure to the lipids found in animal tissue. And finally, for biological and enzymatic process methods for animal-free proteins, biotransformation pioneer companies Afinur and Mycotechnology unveiled cultured protein products with enhanced nutritional features derived from fermentation. And the company Amano announced non-GMO enzymes that release umami and kokumi flavors in plant-based meat and beverages. Next slide. Fermentation as a technology has a different supply chain from plant-based products. It starts with strain selection and development, and using fermentation tanks, also known as bioreactors, along with feedstock to help the cells grow. Follow-up processes include downstream processing, purification, drying, protein recovery, and isolation and concentration. There were key science and technology developments across the entire value chain in 2021. Let's take that step by step, and we'll start with feedstock optimization. Next slide, please. Feedstocks that support microorganisms' growth are a major cost driver for most fermentation processes. So optimizing feedstocks used in alternative protein production promises both economic and sustainability advantages. Several key areas for 2021 innovations within feedstocks are outlined here. This included optimizing or diversifying crops to develop cheaper and more sustainable substrates, such as research into using lignocellulosic plant materials or food-grade side streams for mycoprotein production. Additionally, companies like Afinur, Aquacultured Foods, MicroArena, Liven Proteins, and Hyphae have demonstrated at scale the potential for co-product side streams to serve as inputs for fermentation. For co-locating fermentation production facilities alongside critical inputs, that's a key factor to consider when using side streams in the production of alternative protein. And new types of biorefinery models will be required to integrate alternative protein fermentation modules into overall bioprocess designs. Finally, in terms of diversifying feedstocks, gas fermentation companies that generate protein from the carbon in air, companies like Solar Foods and Air Protein, continued to garner awards and attention in 2021. One unexpected feedstock that popped up in 2021 was plastic waste, which won the Future Insight Prize by showing that you could convert plastic into edible protein by using microbes after an initial pyrolysis step. Next slide. The concept of target selection and design applies only to precision fermentation as a technology platform. Here, the molecule or molecules of interest are referred to as the target. The target can be a protein, a lipid, a flavor compound, a fragrance, an enzyme, a growth factor, a pigment, or even another class of molecule. Key focus areas in target selection advancements in 2021 include progress in automation and computational tools. It also included the emergence of biofoundries, or integrated molecular biology facilities that are complete with high throughput biological and analytical capabilities. And these are a powerful potential tool for alternative proteins. Also, protein structure prediction, specifically Google DeepMind's protein structure prediction algorithm AlphaFold 2, was made freely accessible to the public. Strain development, or improving strains for microbial fermentation, accounts for a significant fraction of research in the fermentation sector thus far, but we've only scratched the surface of the entire solution space here. High throughput methods of strain selection, adaptation, screening, and engineering enable innovators to iterate new strains with greater speed and precision. Key advances in strain development include the US Department of Energy awarding $35 million for re-engineering microbes for the production of useful bioproducts, and breakthroughs for the widely used yeast strain P. pastoris using CRISPR-Cas9 editing tools and methanol-free promoter systems promised 9-fold greater productivity while maintaining yields. Next slide. Next, let's talk about advances in bioprocess design. So historically, the food and pharmaceutical industries utilize bioprocess design improvements to increase the scale, lower the cost, and improve the quality of industrial fermentation processes. But these improvements have focused narrowly on optimizing select culture conditions and fermentation platforms to attain a specific desired end product, such as bioethanol or beer or precision fermented pharmaceuticals. So new paradigms in bioprocess design are necessary for the new strains that are being used by fermentation-derived alternative protein products to achieve that taste and texture to function as true analogs of animal products. Among the advances in bioprocess design for 2021, companies CRB, ZX Ventures, and Culture Biosciences signaled their interest in bringing fermentation-derived alt protein to the scale that's needed for global industrial production. Several companies develop platforms using fermentation as an upstream or downstream processing unit operation. In addition to Affinor and HiFi Foods, which I previously mentioned, the public-private partnership Biopurification of Plant Proteins was established, and Goodside Foods' plant-based meatless crumbles, bioconverted with mycotechnology, were debuted. One major emerging theme in bioprocess design in 2021 was a move to virtual platforms, such as digital twin models, or modeling what's happening biologically in the real world computationally. And finally, innovative bioprocess design for fungal biomass fermentation was demonstrated by multiple companies in 2021 as they scaled their products. Enough, the Better Meat Co. and Aquacultured Foods. Next slide. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the room. Perhaps the greatest hurdle that alternative protein fermentation efforts and the all-protein industry as a whole will face over the next decade is the looming shortage of available fermentation manufacturing capacity. An analysis by Warner Advisors that came out this past year on fermentation manufacturing infrastructure states that 61 million liters of fermentation volumetric capacity associated with CMOs, contract manufacturing organizations, is available globally. 61 million liters is available globally. 49 million liters, or 80% of that, is under contract. It's being utilized, and it can't be utilized by new alternative protein companies entering the space. So only 2 million of the remaining 12 million liters has suitable downstream processing capabilities for food applications. This is another constraint that needs to be taken into account. Finally, approximately 95% of contract fermentation capacity was not originally designed for food applications. And much of the existing capacity was built decades ago, or it lacks updated automation controls. Forecasts of all protein demand suggest that by 2030, meeting the demand for alternative protein from fermentation would require 3 orders of magnitude more fermentation capacity than is currently available. So this deficiency in fermentation suggests that even with the digitization of process design and outsourcing of process development to high throughput service providers, even with that, additional manufacturing fermentation capacity will be required. Now, with all the advances we've seen in industry, there's still white spaces to fill. GFI's research grant program targets those white spaces for funding in order to accelerate research in those areas. 2 relevant grants in 2021 from the Good Food Institute included the production of animal fat substitutes by oleaginous yeasts. This is a product led by Dr. Kyria Boundy-Mills of the University of California, Davis. And this project aims to screen their culture collections oleaginous yeast strains for fat yield and composition, among other food relevant properties. Another grant in this area was the utilization of microalgal fermentation to produce structured plant-based fat for meat analogs, led by Dr. Salma Mohammed Yusuf of University Kebangsaan, Malaysia. And that's to leverage omega-3 rich oils from a species of microalgae in combination with structured plant-derived fats and proteins. Next slide. Finally, let's talk about a technology that's shown increased utility for the alt protein industry. In 2021, plant molecular farming gained increased attention as an innovative production process. Molecular farming itself is not a new technology. It's long been used in developing pharmaceutical therapeutic end products like insulin, antibodies, antigens, and enzymes. But recent advances demonstrate that it could be used for alternative protein production. The process here is similar to precision microbial fermentation, but it uses plants instead of bacteria or fungi as cell factories. And the plants produce ingredients like animal proteins. It's potentially cheaper and more scalable than precision fermentation because it does not require the capital-intensive equipment associated with fermentation. However, plant molecular farming can pose some unique regulatory hurdles, and that depends on whether the plants are intended to be grown outdoors or contained in greenhouses. There may be processing and purification challenges associated with extracting proteins from plant cells, especially ones with strong cell walls. And depending on which tissues the ingredients are expressed in, it could be more or less difficult to extract the molecule of interest. There's more to come from plant molecular farming, and it's going to be exciting to see how the alternative protein industry utilizes this technology platform. Now I'll turn it over to Madeline for our policy update.
Thanks, Ryan. So we'll start with the US regulatory landscape. In the United States, the FDA has regulatory authority over fermentation-derived foods. And there are 2 potential regulatory pathways set forth by FDA that companies can follow to ensure that novel fermentation-derived ingredients and fermentation-derived foods can be sold in the US. The first is the food additive petition pathway, which is a fairly lengthy process involving consultation and studies with FDA, as well as a petition to the agency requesting issuance of a new regulation that specifically allows for direct uses of the ingredient or the additive. The second pathway is the GRAS notice pathway. GRAS stands for generally recognized as safe and means that an ingredient is recognized as safe among qualified experts under the specific conditions of its intended use. A company believing that its product is GRAS for a specific use has two options. They can simply use the product under the assumption that it's GRAS without submitting a formal notice to FDA if there is a high level of confidence in that GRAS conclusion. Or more commonly, companies submit a notice to FDA laying out the intended use of the product and information studies justifying its status as GRAS, and then FDA can respond to that notice. In response, FDA doesn't generally approve or deny products, but rather responds either that there's not enough information available yet to determine that the product is GRAS, or it can issue what's called a no questions letter, which says the FDA doesn't question the company's conclusion that the product is GRAS. And although that's not a formal approval from FDA, it's usually an indication that the product can move forward. Several companies that produce fermentation-derived products have recently received this type of no questions letter from FDA, including Motif for their Himami, Every for its egg white protein, Nature's Find for Phi, and Perfect Day for beta-lactoglobulin. In the EU, the European Food Safety Authority has regulatory jurisdiction, and unlike in the US, all novel foods and ingredients require pre-market authorization before they can be sold in the EU. Fermentation-derived products that are produced without genetic modification or engineering are generally governed by the EU Novel Food Regulation, whereas products that do use GM or GE generally fall under the regulation on genetically modified food and feed. But in both cases, companies must apply to the EFSA for approval and undergo a risk assessment. And importantly, any studies that have been commissioned or conducted with respect to that product have to be disclosed to the agency as part of the application process. If the results of the EFSA's assessment are positive, then the European Union Commission and European Union member states can vote to approve the product. And if it is voted for approval, then that product approval applies throughout all EU member states. The United Kingdom follows virtually the same process as the EU because they retained most of the same framework after Brexit, including the Novel Food Regulation and the regulation on GM food and feed. The major difference is that the UK Food Standards Agency, or FSA, is the one with regulatory authority. And once a product is approved in the UK, it's added to a regulatory list of authorized foods. In Australia and New Zealand, an agency called the Food Standards Australia and New Zealand, or FSANZ, has regulatory authority. And it's a similar process to the EU. Pre-market approval is required for all novel foods and ingredients, and they must undergo a safety assessment of the production processes involved. One company that recently completed that process is Impossible, which received final approval for their heme ingredient in 2021. In Singapore, the SFA has regulatory authority over fermentation-derived foods. They haven't yet put in place a formal regulatory framework, but they have published guidance for novel foods and for safety reviews of novel food products. And they're currently conducting those reviews on a case-by-case basis. Importantly, this past December, they updated their guidance on safety assessments, and the new guidance describes specific categories of information that should be provided as part of product approval applications, as well as links to helpful resources. And they include specific guidance for foods produced by biomass fermentation and ingredients produced through precision fermentation. And SFA generally encourages companies to contact the agency early in the R&D process and to work with the agency if they're going to seek approval. And Impossible's heme and Triton Algae's dried algae ingredient have both been approved under SFA's guidance. Another regulatory issue that's likely to affect a lot of fermentation-derived foods is labeling. In the EU, the government did reject a bill that would have prohibited meat terminology on labels for products that are not completely derived from animals, and also an amendment that would have banned any evocation of dairy, like pictures of dairy, pictures of milk, words like creamy on any products that weren't derived from animals. But unfortunately, terms like dairy, milk, and yogurt remain prohibited on products in the EU unless they contain dairy from a milked animal. In the US, there are currently no federal labeling regulations specific to fermentation-derived foods, although the National Bioengineered Food Disclosure Standard, which became active this past January, that was promulgated by the USDA, may apply to some fermentation products. And later this year, FDA is set to release guidance on the labeling of plant-based milk products and also begin drafting guidance for other plant-based alternatives to animal products. And it's possible that some of that guidance could apply to fermentation-derived foods, or at least preview the agency's approach to labeling fermentation foods, but it's just too soon to tell until that guidance comes out. Nomenclature related to labeling is an issue that may be subject to regulation in the future. In terms of the names used to describe fermentation-derived products and ingredients, companies themselves are still not completely aligned on terminology, but there does seem to be a consensus emerging around the term animal-free within the precision fermentation space. You can see on this slide a few examples of how companies have described their ingredients, either in B2B situations or as listed on product labels. And you can see Nick's Ice Cream, Modern Kitchen, Bold Culture, Every, Brave Robot, and Starbucks have all used the term animal-free recently. Biomass fermentation companies, on the other hand, have largely adopted branded names for their proteins like Fermotine or Phi. And if the upcoming guidance from FDA that I discussed doesn't apply to fermentation-derived foods, it's possible that in the future, the agency might specifically address fermentation nomenclature, at least on consumer-facing products. Finally, turning to public funding, 2021 saw significant government support for fermentation-enabled proteins from both federal and state agencies, public universities, public innovation incubators, as well as green banks. And you can see on the slide a list of the grants and loans and awards from 2021. It was an absolutely fantastic year, and we hope to see even more government support in 2022.
All right, thank you so much, Maddie. We will now move into the question and answer session of today's webinar. We have just about 11 minutes for any questions you might have. If you could just ask your questions in the Q&A box rather than the chat, we'll try to get to as many as possible today. So our first question, I think, would be for Liz or Ryan on the call. And they are asking if the non-GMO project verified will allow the use of CRISPR-Cas9. Do either of you know the answer to that?
I might toss this one to Maddie as well. I was just pulling up non-GMO project. Each of these certifications have slightly different rules for what they consider within scope or out of scope for their particular certifications, which don't always align with what regulatory bodies within specific companies or geographic jurisdictions decide to define these technologies. For non-GMO projects in particular, it does appear that they consider CRISPR-Cas9 to fall within a new technique for genetic modification.
Fantastic. And Liz, there's another question here. Will plant molecular farming have the same challenges as fermentation in terms of capacity constraints?
That's a great question. I think one of the advantages and part of the enthusiasm around plant molecular farming is that it does allow users of that approach to get away from some of the infrastructure constraints. Crops in the field that are used as these plant hosts are able to be scaled, essentially in field production. There may be some cases where greenhouse use may be required for a sort of secondary containment, depending on regional or geographic regulatory considerations or individual protein and product considerations. But these plant systems don't require the sort of large bioreactor fermentation capacity that's necessary for microbial fermentation. So they can be advantageous in that way. There will still need to be infrastructure for the downstream purification. So for isolating the protein of interest or ingredient of interest from that plant biomass, there will still need to be infrastructure there. But that's a slightly different concern from sort of the straight volumetric capacity concerns that we see in microbial fermentation for growth of the microbial hosts themselves.
Thanks so much, Liz. And Maddie, maybe you can address this next question here. What more do you think we can do as industry leaders and as consumers to try to encourage regulatory movement in regions like the EU or the UK?
Yeah, I mean, that's tough because they already have these regulatory frameworks in place that apply to all novel foods. And so they're treating fermentation derived foods the same as sort of any other new technology under the regulatory framework that already exists. But I think one thing that's really important is when you're doing any sort of government outreach or lobbying is to just continually explain with, as much evidence and support as possible, all of the positive benefits of these new foods, including the sustainability benefits, the public health benefits, the food and national security benefits. And then I think as these foods become more popular in countries and parts of the world that maybe have slightly less strict regulations, there's also the economic opportunity loss in countries that are being more restrictive. So that's another thing that we can sort of point out as the sector grows.
Fantastic. And we have this next question here. How can fermentation companies get the public excited enough about their products to make the switch from animal-based proteins? And, I would say that we need to have products that cost the same or less and taste just as good or better than traditional animal products. And if fermentation companies are able to do that, they have a very compelling story as to why people should make the switch to these more sustainable sources of protein, particularly on the taste side of things. And the next question, maybe Ryan, you can address this. Could you share a little bit more about startups plugging into the up and downstream processing part of the value chain for biomass fermentation? Is there any more you can share about what companies like Hyphy Food are doing and what areas that you see are as opportunities here?
Absolutely. Thanks, Audrey. Yeah, this is a great question. A really exciting development. We're really excited to see a lot of companies pop up that are able to use different side streams and co-products to develop high value alternative protein products. So in many ways, they're able to plug into what's coming off of crop production and not currently utilized as human food and turn it into human food and do that in a food safe way. So I'll say that companies like Hyphy and Affinor are developing really interesting processes that are really a step in the processing chain that go from side stream or co-product to an end product, something that people can eat. So I'll say the state of the industry report outlinks to these companies and talks about what they're doing. And there's really some great information in there that elaborates on all these companies. The other thing I want to highlight is that the Good Food Institute is currently conducting a side streams analysis, which is looking across the board at all alternative protein platforms, cultivated meat, fermentation, and plant-based. What are the side streams that each of these platforms produces, and what are the common agricultural and food industry side streams that could be utilized? to reduce cost and to promote environmental sustainability. So we have that analysis coming out in the future. So do stay tuned in and plugged into GFI newsletters. And other than that, the State of the Industry report here for fermentation, I think, elaborates on all the great work that these companies are doing.
Thanks, Ryan. And Maddie, the next question that I'd like to point your way. So this person is saying that all protein research, they've read that it's grossly underfunded by the American government, considering that it's an integral part of climate tech. Do you foresee that changing in the future?
I definitely think there's an opportunity for that to change. In the recent draft reports that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has put out, they are identifying alternative proteins as potential solutions to make our food systems more sustainable. And we've got some members of Congress, including Rep. Rosa DeLauro, who have been on the front lines of really promoting alternative proteins as a climate solution. But I definitely think, anyone who has any capacity to call on the government for more increased funding, to sign on to appropriations letters, anything that we can do to encourage the government to see this as the climate solution that it is, will help us, increase public funding.
Thanks, Maddie. And turning to you, Liz, we have a question here asking for any assessments you may have on the possible dangers of genetic modifications within the fermentation sector.
Sure, happy to speak to this. So, of course, as multiple of our speakers noted, fermentation has been used to produce ingredients in the food industry for quite a long period of time. And so there are assessments in place that are part of the regulatory approval process for products made through fermentation, particularly for recombinant protein production or precision fermentation products, where it may be introducing a new gene that may code for a new protein into these expression organisms. When talking about new proteins, there can be questions around allergenicity of proteins that may look slightly different to the human body than proteins from the original source organism. And those potential flags to look out for are well known by the industry, and assessments are well validated for looking at differences between proteins that might be triggers for any sort of allergenicity, and those are again part of that process. So this again is not a new technology per se. These are sort of new application areas for a well-validated technology that again has been used in multiple other sectors of the food industry, but something to certainly pay credence to that work that's come before to develop those assessment processes.
Thanks so much, Liz. And I think we have time for just one more brief question. And Sharon, I'll turn to you for this. How can the bottleneck in the shortage of fermentation infrastructure be addressed quickly? What would your response to that be, or solution be?
An excellent question, and luckily I've got the easy solution for all of us. It's a big problem, right? We need to align many stakeholders globally. We need the individuals who can finance the facilities, right? Can put the capital to work and have a long-term view on understanding it can take a few years to build these facilities. The payoff can take a little time, but then it's a nice steady stream of income that is also, of course, bettering the planet and adhering to many investors' ESG goals. The other individuals are those who are operating the facility. So that can be startups themselves, right? So that you can have investors funding startups with debt financing or project financing to support that. Or we can support CDMOs, contract manufacturers, who can build out this capacity, and then they could have companies who are actually creating these end products and these end ingredients come in and lease their equipment and their facilities. Governments also have a big role to play, and we are seeing them step up. So there are a number of global governments who are creating either investing their own capital or creating schemes that encourage capital investment by the private sector to build manufacturing facilities in their countries. And some of them really are looking at it as a way to, one, use some of their waste streams in their own country from their agricultural production or other production streams, and a way to address food insecurity in their own countries, right? So gain control over food production domestically. So there's really a lot of benefits to this infrastructure and a lot of players we need to collect. If anybody on this call is interested in kind of can play a role in any of these three areas, certainly please reach out to us. We're trying to help make some of these connections globally.
Thanks so much, Sharon. And those are all the time that we have for questions today. Thank you everyone for attending. We will all be moving over to Meetaway right now for a speed networking session. We'd love for you to join us. We'll drop the link in the chat here in case you haven't signed up yet. So please go ahead and register for speed networking. We'll see you there. But thank you everyone and see you on Meetaway.